Right, we are live. Joining me today are two supremely special guests, Joe LeDoux and David Rosenthal. Guys, for those who don't know you, I wonder if you could say just a little bit something about who you are and what you do. And I guess, I don't know, going alphabetically, maybe Joe, you could start.
Sure.
Alphabetically back first.
I'm a neuroscientist. I study motion and memory. I've done that for many years. I've been interested in consciousness since I did my PhD research on split brain patients in the 1970s. And I've always kind of written about it, but have never really researched it since those days. And lately been getting more into writing about how emotion and memory might be integrated into consciousness and maybe help that field out a little bit by expanding its content a bit.
And David, I wonder if you could also say something about who you are and what you do.
Sure. I'm a professor of philosophy and cognitive science, and I work mainly on consciousness for some years, and also on the nature of mental qualities. And excuse me, that's good enough.
Okay.
That good enough?
That's excellent. Yes, very good. Thank you very much. And thank you guys very much for taking the time to join me today. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. I like your shirt, by the way, Joe. I see the No Self, No Fear shirt. This is one of your specialty sorts of things. So I wonder, since I'm looking at the shirt here, if we may as well start by asking you what the meaning of that shirt is.
Okay, well, in my last book, which was published in last August, called The Deep History of Ourselves, the 4 billion year story of how we got conscious brains, I build up the story from bacteria through humans about the evolution of behavior, but talk about the importance of oneself as being involved in an experience that, that I talk about in terms of autonoetic consciousness, a term borrowed from Endel Tulving, in which the self is part of the experience. So it's not just about seeing the apple, but it's knowing that it's you that's seeing the apple. And so, yeah, we got no self, no fear. And these days, though, it's probably more appropriate, got self, got fear, with all of the stuff that's going on around us.
Yeah, lots of fear. Exactly. These are good times for talking about anxiety. I know, David, you're still in Manhattan, but Joe, yeah, exactly. So what do you think about this no self, no fear view, David?
Well, I think it's a little tricky. So I think that there are kind of two levels that are going on here. I do think that with the emotions in general, as Joe has stressed in some of his recent writing, that an emotion in effect has something to do with the relationship of the self to something or another. For example, the relationship of the self to some object that's perceived as dangerous or threatening or something of that sort in the case of fear. But then I think that there's a second level, which is completely distinct from the first level, about the way in which an emotional state comes to be conscious. I think the way an emotional state comes to be conscious is that you become aware of yourself as being in that state. So the self figures in a second way when consciousness enters the picture. So I would draw a distinction between those two ways in which the self figures in emotions.
So I mean,
are these two ways?
I have one slight difference, which is that for me, an emotion is a conscious experience. I think for you, it's probably not necessarily. And so there's only a conscious experience of fear when you know that it's you that's going to be bitten by the snake. So if it's not going to hurt you, there's nothing to be afraid of. And it's that awareness that you are the subject of this thing that is happening is the emotion for me.
Well, let me ask you a question about that, Joe. I'm not so much interested in the folk meaning of the word fear as just what kinds of things happen psychologically. And it seems to me that one can subliminally see some object, maybe that doesn't automatically trigger like a spider or a snake or something, but a person one believes has the virus or something. And so it's got to be a situation where there's a lot of conceptualization, and I see this person and the person is approaching me, and but I might see the person subliminally, and I might then conceptualize the situation as a dangerous situation, but the conceptualization might be unconscious. And then all of that, the perception of something that I conceptualize as a dangerous situation, that could all become conscious. So there are two levels here, and whether, I mean, one might want to reserve the term fear just for the conscious situation, but there is an unconscious psychological state involving a perception and conceptualization that would be independent, that could occur independently.
I think we're kind of saying the same thing and just talking around each other, because, you know, I think that there's this pre-conscious, well, the higher order state, basically, that's non-conscious, kind of as a mental model that is conceptualizing what's going on, and that the content of that mental model is then what you consciously experience. So I don't think we're talking about anything very different. So fear would be the result of that. I wouldn't necessarily call the mental model, I mean, I call it a fear mental model, but it's not the experience of fear. Yeah. So my main thing with my main concern about conscious, unconscious, and fear is when we put fear into a structure like the amygdala and say that it's bubbling up, you know, that's where the fear is being made. I don't think that's where it's being made, because that conceptualization is being done in cortical areas.
Right. No, that makes perfectly good sense to me. I just want to reserve a place for something that is the unconscious psychological occurrence that corresponds to conscious fear.
Totally agree.
Okay, terrific.
So
let me ask you though. Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead, David. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to check on this, on the level of agreement here, because so part of what I hear David as saying is that even if you detect danger non-consciously or subliminally, it still has to be attributed in some sense that you are the person in danger. Otherwise, it's not going to matter psychologically. So if it's not just stimulus and response, then there's got to be some sense in which the detection of the danger involves the self, even at the level where consciousness isn't involved.
Yeah, so the mental model integrates schema and other schemas, and that's it's all put into there.
Yes.
Is that the same self that's involved? I mean, so there's this, so we could distinguish the self like as a bodily self, the self that's distinct from merely other animals in the environment, versus this psychological notion of the self as maybe something a little more substantive, or do you think that this kind of distinction is going to figure in any of these?
Well, definitely, I'm talking about the psychological self. I think David is too. The question is whether there are different versions of the psychological self that we might throw out. Not throw out, but talk about.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, you know, in some of the things you and I have written, we've talked about thick versus thin versions of the self, for example. So I see an apple as a thin version, whereas if, you know, I know that it's the apple that is going to make me sick because somebody injected something into it that I saw. So I know that that's going to, now I'm talking about a thicker version because it's involving me, not just me as a passive witness that there's an apple on the table. I don't need to, you know, have a declarative statement in my head saying I see an apple. I just see the apple. I have that kind of familiarity with what's going on without having to name it as myself. But maybe once we're talking about something that's going to harm you, it's more that you are, you know, front and center in that representation.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that all of this about the apple might harm one or something like that is just additional information. It's not a different kind of self. So you might have more information about the apple also. That wouldn't make it a different apple. You might say, well, it was grown in this orchard and blah, blah, blah. So there's more information about the self in the second case, but I think it's the same self. It's one and the same self that sees the apple and also might get damaged by the apple, namely me.
So I just want to interject something that this conversation, obviously, the three of us know, but the rest of the world doesn't know that we've been having these regular lunches at B-Bar in New York. And so now instead of having our lunch discussion, we brought this to the world to share it with. And these have always been a lot of fun. And so I'm glad we're here under these conditions. Thank you, Richard.
Yes, oh, sure.
Me
happy
too.
To be here. Yes, myself is
terrific.
Happy.
I mean, it's very nice to be here with the rest of the world, although I also miss B-Bar.
Yeah.
They have good fries there. I like their fries. But so what do you think about what David was saying, Joe? I mean, I appreciate those very fine words, but what do you think about this, that it's the same self? Because this is something that I've always been curious about, the difference between in the Tolving, the noetic and autonoetic. So let me just ask, do you agree with the idea that it's the same self in both cases?
I think it's, let's talk about noetic versus autonoetic, because that's probably a good way to, I mean, that's where my thoughts are. So that's a good way to maybe say what I have in mind. So a noetic experience is an experience in which you have a kind of semantic or factual understanding of something, like, there's an apple. And an autonoetic one is one in which your self comes into it because you're relating yourself to experiences you've had in the past and to experiences you might have in the future, as well as the one you're having in the present. So, I mean, that's really the self when we're talking about the self. The other thing is more of a, it's a kind of acquaintance that's there whenever we have an experience, but it's not part of the experience. I don't have a strong opinion about whether it's a different self or the same self. I mean, I don't know how we parse that, but I do believe that when we are having those two kinds of experiences, one being more of a reflective state in which we are personally involved, and the other just being a kind of factual state where nothing much is going on, that those might be different kinds of selves. If there's a self in the first one at all, I don't know.
It does seem to me that there's a self in the first one, the seeing an apple case. And if there's an acquaintance with an apple, it's going to be your acquaintance or Richard's acquaintance or my acquaintance or somebody's acquaintance. It can't be nobody's acquaintance. It can't be a kind of acquaintanceless seeing of an apple. So I do think it's not that I think that there's no difference between the two kinds of case, but I think we can understand the difference in terms of the richness of information that's connected with the self in one case and the absence of any kind of richness in the other case.
Yeah, I was reading something yesterday and today by Stanley Klein, who is addressing these kinds of issues, and I found it very informative. I forget what the name of the paper is, but it's very interesting.
Is this the one you sent us in an email?
I send you so many things, I can't remember which one I sent. It was by Klein. That was it.
Yeah.
But I think, no, that was the one I sent you. I know what you're talking about. The I and me thing.
That's the Wozniak one. Yeah. Yeah. That's a different one. Okay, so I don't know the Klein piece.
I don't either.
Do you want to give us a rundown on it, or should we?
Well, it's kind of like what we're talking about, that, we don't have to, we can have propositional statements. I see an apple, but that doesn't capture the subjective experience of, what he's interested in is this, this feeling of ownership you have when you are having a conscious experience. So you have that ownership when there's an apple, and you don't need to tell yourself you're seeing the apple. It's yours simply by this acquaintance of being there. And it would be the same thing in the other state where, you know, you are more intensely involved, but you would also be part of that other state. So you would be part of the content. But in both cases, it would be kind of a familiarity or an ownership by way of association or acquaintance.
Yeah. So, I mean, so in this non-conscious case where you detect danger in the environment, and so we agree that there's this the schema that's being completed in some sense and giving you information about what's out there and also relating it to you. It's not conscious yet, but there's a sense in which that you're connecting it to the fact that I'm the one that's in danger. Otherwise, I don't think you would care very much. That's why I brought in the stimulus response stuff earlier. So if it were just stimulus response kind of automatically wired in, then you could see why the animal would behave in a certain way. But once you start going up to the psychological level, then there's got to be some kind of attribution of the state to me, but that's at a totally non-conscious level so far. And I thought we all agreed on that a second ago. Yep. And so that self right there, well, you could have as much information about you and past states and present states and so forth, and it could still be non-conscious, right? I mean, you could have all that other stuff, all the autonoetic stuff, right, and still have it not be conscious if you weren't aware of it, right, at a higher level.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you know, the idea is that you've got all these schema, self, emotion, perceptual schema all going on simultaneously, non-consciously. These are the active components of the larger body of information you have about your perceptions, your emotions, your self. But the active components then are combined into one representation that would be the mental model, which is basically a non-conscious higher order state that could then be experienced.
What's higher order mean here?
Exactly what you mean. It's a David Rosenthal state.
Well, a David Rosenthal state is a state whose content is, I am aware of myself as being in this state. Is that what you mean?
It depends on what how I-ish the I is.
Well, it's I-ish enough to be me and not you.
Yes, that's we're good.
Why isn't, I mean, we may still be sort of talking past each other a little bit in this degrees of I-ishness. Yeah. But all I mean is, so I'm aware of an apple, mm-hmm, and I'm aware of myself as being in this state. It's the same I.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fine. It's you know, I think the propositional statements give the I more I-ness than we're talking about.
Okay, but it's if the apple is in front of me and I see it, and then it's me that's seeing it and not you if you're not around.
Right. Absolutely. So the you know, like this sense of ownership is most apparent when it's missing in certain kinds of pathology. So it's, you know, when you have dissociations or psychosis, where the person is no longer owning their mental states, it's not that the person normally says, oh, I'm experiencing the apple, but you have this, the thing Klein is talking about, this kind of feeling of ownership, or this by acquaintance, that who else could it be that's having this state? It's just like an implicit assumption. You've had so many mental states in your life, you don't need to acknowledge each one. Oh, that's me. Oh, that's me. It's just there because who else could it be?
Well, you don't need to acknowledge it, like make a thing of it, but if anybody were to say, I mean, you know, if you came across some weird person in philosophy, for example, who said to you, well, actually, who is it who's seeing the apple? You'd say, it's me.
Right.
Right. And that's not something that you don't make a point of it's being me that's seeing the apple in everyday life. You just go about your business seeing apples. Right. But if the question arises, there's no issue about who's seeing it. It's me. And it's just as good a self as any other self that figures in these conversations, I think.
Yeah, I can go with that.
Good.
Richard, I keep getting notices that my internet connection is unstable, so hopefully it will just keep being notices.
Okay. Yeah, we broke up a couple times, but it seems like it's going okay so far.
Yeah,
no, you didn't break up at all with me.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm in the country, so it's a little weaker.
I see.
Yeah. Mine, not to brag, says excellent.
Well, your internet connection is the one that matters, Richard, because you're broadcasting to the world.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, so I mean, I find this discussion very interesting because I mean, for someone like me, I think the self is kind of phenomenologically there in ordinary experiences. I mean, there's me, there's a point of view from which I'm seeing things. And if I sort of reflect on what it's like for me right now, I'd say, well, you know, there's someone who's seeing this stuff, and that if, like David said, I don't really, in normal, without the reflection part, I just take it for granted. But if you pushed me, I would say, well, of course it's me that's seeing it. And that's different than in cases like, you know, the thought insertion or something like that, where you have someone who says, these aren't my thoughts, or, you know, alien limb phenomena, where they say, that's not my arm or something like that. So the sense of ownership, I think, is an important aspect of it, but I'm not even, yeah, so it's not clear to me that that's necessary for ordinary conscious experiences.
I'm not sure that I'm understanding the contrast you just drew. So in a case of thought insertion, where I go like that and insert a thought into you, it wouldn't be inserting unless it got into you, right? So it's your thought, it's just that it's not causally your thought, so to speak. It's not, you don't have an agential connection with the thought that you would with your normal thoughts, but it's not somebody else's thought because I put it into you.
Yeah, no, I was thinking of like in schizophrenia, where they deny that the thoughts that they, I think, really are theirs are in fact theirs.
Well, but what I'm suggesting is that there's a kind of equivocation here between whether the thought occurs in a particular mind and whether the thought is due to that particular mind. And those two things can then come apart, and that's interesting.
Yeah.
But it's not as though the thought is somebody else's. I didn't insert it into Joe, I inserted it into you, so to speak.
Right, but that would be a case where they don't experience it as theirs. But yet
Well,
they still
what
have
I'm
experience.
suggesting is that, I mean, so it's a matter of how the question is being asked. I think that I haven't seen in the thought insertion literature due attention to this distinction that I'm drawing between which mind is the thought occurring in versus which mind is the causal agency for the thought, right? And I think that when these people deny that it's their thought, what they're denying is the causal agency thing.
Right, they don't think they're the author of the thought.
That's exactly right, yes. And that's a perfectly good sense for whether it's my thought or not, but it's not the only sense.
Right, but don't you think there's a sense that, so I see what you're saying, that there's a sense in which they do have ownership of the thought because clearly it's in their mind.
Right.
And there's a sense in which they don't have ownership of the thought because they don't experience themselves as the agent of the thought.
That's right. That's exactly right, I think.
Yeah. So, but in that second sense, then isn't there an issue for the kind of thing that we've been talking about? Because there's a case where they don't seem to represent the thought as being theirs. So if they were asked whose thought it was, they would say, it's not, I'm not thinking it, or it's not, I'm not the author of it, at least.
Well, I'm not the author of it. I mean, so you were talking in a way that I didn't fully understand about this phenomenology stuff. And I thought that the phenomenology stuff was mainly about what mind is the thought in, as opposed to who was the author of the thought.
Yeah. So I guess I would say kind of both of them are there.
I'm sorry.
Seems both to me. So I wasn't thinking about thoughts per se, but just ordinary conscious experience. So when I'm experiencing something, it seems to me that phenomenologically it's like part of my mind, but also it's like me that's experiencing it.
Well, let me ask you a question about this phenomenology stuff.
Okay.
I'm assuming that you would agree that thoughts can occur unconsciously.
Me, yes.
You. And then there's no phenomenology.
No.
But it's still my thought, and maybe I even author it, or maybe I don't. But anyway, I mean, all of the things that can happen vis-a-vis it's being my thought can occur and will occur even in the unconscious cases. So it can't be that phenomenology is the explanation of the self being connected, what mind the thought occurs in, and who the agent is.
Right. No, I agree with that. No, my only point was to kind of push on Joe's point from before, that there's this, that the self is not really substantially involved in ordinary conscious experiences.
Oh, I see. Yes. Well, I'm agreeing with you about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, when I said it's not involved, what I meant was not in an active sense of, it's me that's doing it. It's just you are doing it, and it's implicit though.
Well, it's implicit in the sense that you're not highlighting it,
Until you're at, as you said.
It's not as though when I say to you, by the way, that thought that you just expressed a moment ago, whose thought was that? You don't have to think about what the answer is, right? It's completely automatic that it's your thought. So it's right there, right? It's not a big deal.
Right. So, it's, in a way, it's kind of, you could say it's a mental habit. You've had so many thoughts that are yours, and there's never been anybody's thoughts that weren't yours, that you never have to ask yourself or even think about it.
Okay. I guess I'm not sure what it would, I think I know what it would be like for me to have thoughts that aren't mine in the who authored them sense,
Right.
but I don't know what it would be like for me to have thoughts that aren't mine in what mind do they occur sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you're an essential indexical. You don't think it can have this kind of failure of self-identification, or what is it? Failure of reference or misidentification of the self, or something like that.
Oh. Well, I think that that's another question, which maybe, I have doubts about this immunity to identification of the self. Maybe, can I beg off of that one for the moment?
Yeah.
I don't think that that's the same thing that I'm talking about. I think that in every case where I have a thought, where a thought occurs in my mind, it's second nature for me to identify myself as the individual that has that thought, and not just because that's the way it's always been, but that's the way it always is.
Right.
Yeah, so I guess I'm a little more, I guess I think that it's possible that you could have a thought and mistakenly experience it as occurring in your head.
Well, I don't know about my head, but my mind.
Yeah. like this is in David's mind, I think, as a coherent experience that one could have. It sounds like what you're saying is that
I'm sorry, which thought is this?
It
The
might
thought
be.
that you just had?
Yeah.
Well, then if you just had it, it
Well,
doesn't
a
seem to
thought
me.
like that, would it be the thought you just had?
Oh, I think we can have certainly thoughts that are identical in all of their mental properties, except for which mind they occur in.
Well, I meant being mistaken about in which mind it's in, which is why I brought the immunity stuff up. But so, you know, take a case like, what's a good case? Well, I guess rubber hand illusion sort of is in the ballpark, but not really. What's that? There are some cases where people are mistaken about what's a part of their body and what isn't. Rubber hand illusion is the only one that's coming to my mind, although I don't think it's the best example of this, but you mistakenly think that the rubber hand is yours. People flinch when you swing the hammer at it, sort of expecting that it's gonna. So there's a case where you're experiencing seemingly something which isn't a part of your body as out there. So wouldn't it be conceptually possible that you could have like alien limb rubber hand syndrome, where you think the rubber hand is not part of yours, it's not your hand, but you're experiencing the experiences in it. So you'd be wrong about both that it's a part of you and also where the experience is taking place.
I don't see how that would work. I mean, I think that the rubber hand thing is the visual and proprioceptive stuff get messed up. So it's not a mysterious thing. It's that the two senses are not being coordinated in the normal way. And I'm not quite sure what the analog of that would be.
Yeah, okay. I guess I just have a different, anyway, so let's let this pass because I'm not sure if it's too technical and too complicated. But can we circle back around to, because didn't I interrupt you a bit ago, David? You were going to ask a question that was going to send us down a different track, or did you already ask that question?
Which question was this that I was going to ask?
Well, you said, Joe, let me ask you a question, and then it seemed like I sort of interjected.
I guess so. A little while ago, I asked Joe used the term high order, and I jumped on that and said, what do you mean by high order? And he said he meant by high order what I mean by high order. Then we talked about that for a while. But I guess what I would like to ask Joe in this context, because I'm not clear about it. So there are two, current biology has these wonderful my word things, and Joe has one that's already occurred, which is, I forget the title.
The non-conscious becomes conscious.
Yeah.
Right. And another that is in press, I guess, which is called Thinking Feelings.
Thoughtful feelings.
Thoughtful feelings.
Yeah.
At some point in that second paper, I think you say something like this, that high order theorists like me like this something metacognitive something or another. But I was wondering what your explanation is. So we've established, we agree that there is a non-conscious psychological thing that corresponds to conscious fear. And there's, of course, conscious fear. So what is the difference? And in particular, let me frame it this way. One of the things that I really love about both of these my word papers of yours is that you make a big deal out of what I'll just summarize as conceptualization. You call schemas and so forth, and semantic memory, and these conceptualizing factors that figure really in all of our everyday conscious experiences, and which I think are very important, and which the consciousness literature really has vastly ignored, right? And I think it's an extremely good thing to bring that to center stage.
Could I just say a word about that and then we'll come back?
Please. Yeah, sure.
So, yeah,
Please.
the reason, you know, as an outsider in the kind of visual perceptual consciousness field, it occurred to me very like it was such a missing thing that we don't know what apples and snakes are innately, and maybe snakes,
Right.
you know, but we have to learn what these things are through our experience. So when we see an apple, it's not just the visual cortex and prefrontal cortex, that it's not a debate between just visual cortex and prefrontal cortex, but you also got to bring in these memory areas that are going to be supplementing that to allow you to know what the hell it is you're looking at.
Exactly.
It seemed like such an obvious missing thing. And, you know, coming out from the outside, things are obvious that you get maybe tunnel vision sometimes on the inside. So that's why I introduced those. But it's really, I guess the other angle on this that I want to mention is that it kind of comes up if you look at something like dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and ask, what are its main inputs? And almost the only input that is talked about in the consciousness world is from visual cortex to dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, as if that's the key thing. But the dorsolateral prefrontal gets many more or more substantial inputs from all these memory and schema areas than it does from the visual input. The visual input is almost minuscule compared to all the memory information it's getting about that same stimulus. So there's like a flow of like from very, very primitive sensory to semantic memory to schemas to episodic memories and schemas and all of this that's coming to bear on what it is you're looking at. And it all comes from the anatomy of just asking what is connected to the prefrontal cortex in a way. So anyway, so I just wanted to kind of state why I did that and where it came from. Now you can continue with whatever it was you're headed for.
Yeah, so let me say again, I just think all of that is terrific. And I certainly didn't, in my mentioning this, mean to downplay the important things that you say in those two papers about the inputs to dorsolateral PFC. Right. There's another thing I guess I would say. So a favorite sort of thing for people in philosophy to talk about is a conscious experience of red. Right. And so you imagine somebody is sitting in a chair and the person is flashed red on a screen. It seems to me that even in this allegedly more or less purely qualitative case where you're focusing on input just from the visual areas, there's going to be conceptualizing, because you're going to conceptualize this as red. You're going to conceptualize it as having all of the semantic memory and schema background that go with red things and so forth. And you're going to do that more or less instantaneously. So, yeah. And this is just overlooked in the literature, I think. And it makes the literature less rich and also less accurate. But anyway, with all of that said, it seems to me that you can have all of the conceptualization in the world and still the state, the psychological state, might not be conscious. Right. And we're agreed about that, yes?
Right.
So what is it, are you then agreed with high order people like Richard and me that basically speaking what's going on is that what makes the state conscious is that the individual is aware of him or herself as being in that state?
I kind of think that that already happens at this last non-conscious step. I mean, that the high order state, as you would say, is itself not conscious, right?
Well, the high order state is not conscious, but the high order state is an awareness of the state. of the lower order state, of the first order state. So just to speak in simple terms, let's say the first order state occurs with all of the complications about conceptualization and schemas and so forth, and it still isn't conscious. And then this higher order awareness occurs. And the higher order awareness is not itself a conscious state, but it's a consciousness of the first order state. And it's being a consciousness of the first order state is what makes us feel, well, we're in the first order state. That's what makes it, as it were, intuitively light up.
So what I would say is, I mean, you know, Richard and I went off on a horror road, especially Richard, and I've followed him a bit on that road.
Right.
But
yeah, so on the horror view, the higher order state is a state of consciousness, phenomenal consciousness in particular.
Well, but is it a conscious state?
Phenomenal consciousness involves conscious states or conscious, I mean, yes, it is a conscious state.
I see. So it's a state of which you are conscious?
No.
Oh, okay. Just to be clear.
Yeah, it's not a state of which you're conscious. By the way, someone who's watching this suggested somatoparaphrenia as the thing I was fishing around for as a better example of the thing I was fishing for earlier. So
oh, sure.
I would like to put a pin in that and come back to it, because I think that's exactly the right road to explore the kind of question I was interested in. But still, so on this point, so for I mean, as I understand the debate on David's view, when you have the higher order states, you know, I'm seeing red or whatever the case is, then the first order state is the state that's conscious. That's the state that you experience. You experience yourself as being in that first order state. And I certainly agree about that. I just think that for kind of technical reasons, by empty higher thoughts, stuff like that, that it's best to say that the higher order state itself is what phenomenal consciousness is. Having that state is what it means to consciously experience something. And I think David actually has to sort of agree with this at some level, because you say a lot, David, that a state's being conscious consists in having the appropriate kind of higher order thought around. And so depending on how you read that consists in, I think you're going to get a horror type view, because that's just what the property of consciousness is, having the higher order state. So that's why I say the things that I said, the horror theory, that's why it says it's the things that it says. But this other thing that you guys were, that's a slightly different question. I thought that you were just trying to press Joe on, because
yes, I think it is a different question.
Yeah, exactly. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that there is an issue between David and I, but I think it's a different issue than the one that we were just talking about. Because there, what David was kind of working towards, I think, was in what sense the higher order state is non-conscious. So it certainly is non-conscious in the sense that you're not aware of being in it. So it's not conscious in that sense. But in this other sense, it's what the consciousness of the first order state consists in. So when you have it, you have conscious experience. But I thought you were denying that, Joe. So I thought that was what the issue a second ago was.
You know, what I'm concerned with in this is that, you know, to say that it's the first order state that you're aware of is going back to what we were just kind of saying is needs improving, which is that it's, let's just take it for the sake of argument that the high order state is in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. To say that it's the first order state implies, I think is what you're saying, it's the visual cortex state that now you're conscious of. But what we've been talking about is the visual cortex state may not be the main lower order state upon which the higher order experience is being founded. So if most of the inputs to dorsolateral are coming not from visual cortex, but from other prefrontal areas that have received inputs from memory areas and also from visual cortex, and then the question is, are you willing to say that what you're conscious of in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is these other prefrontal cortex states that are the lower order state antecedent to the high order state?
Absolutely. Sorry, what was that last thing about high order something?
The the prefrontal, you have prefrontal states that are antecedent to the higher order state. Are you conscious of those prefrontal states?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's, Joe, that's a large part of my enthusiasm about your stressing these other aspects of any ordinary experience. That when an experience is a conscious experience, then one is conscious not only of the visual input, but all the other stuff that you stress.
Okay.
And I think that that's extremely important. But I'm reserving the term higher order. I mean, this is just, it's a terminological thing. It has no theoretical significance. I'm reserving the term higher order in the way I'm talking for that last bit where I become aware of this kind of combined state. The combined state meaning the visual input plus all of the other stuff.
Okay.
Can I just ask really quickly, David? So David, so what I hear you saying is that you agree that what you call a first order state can be found in the prefrontal cortex.
Well, yeah, partly it'll be in PFC, and partly it'll be in visual cortex. It may be a complicated thing. It may be a multimodal experience, like I both see and hear you. And so then it'll be an auditory cortex as well. And the stuff that's going on in PFC to bring all of that together is going to be even more complicated.
So yeah, I think both of you know I've suggested that we not call them first order, but lower order, so that you could have different gradations of lower order. That some would be equivalent to what you're calling first order and sensory, but when you get into memory, is that I know it's still about the environment, so you would say it's still first order, but I think that a terminology that recognizes the gradations of lower order states preceding the higher order state would be useful.
I'm perfectly okay with that. It seems to me, though, that although there will be a kind of a hierarchy in the sense that there will be visual input, for example, and the visual input will trigger various memory things and schemata and so forth, so that there will be a progression. I'm not sure the difference between the differences among states at these different levels, where the levels are defined in terms of this progression, is not the same as the difference between what I'm calling first order and higher order. That's just a matter of content.
Right.
So higher order is just being aware of oneself as being in a state, and first order is everything else.
So
but Joe's point though is that it helps us to call it lower order, because then it's sort of built in that there could be many things down there, whereas calling it first order tends to fuel this assumption that it's going to be like in the visual cortex, in the first visual areas or something like that. I think that's part of what your complaint is, right, Joe?
So I mean, if we have all these levels, I mean, you know, conceivably you could have a higher order state that allows you to be aware of many of these different levels depending on the circumstances. So you might have a kind of redness in the visual cortex. It's different from the experience of the redness that's coming from memory cortex or from schema and ventromedial prefrontal cortex. But, you know, they would all seem like a conscious experience of red, but there could be gradations in how that experience is being built up neurologically that could give us insights into the vast kinds of experiences we could have, rather than collapsing it all into one thing.
I'm very enthusiastic about all of that.
Good.
I think that's all not only true, but very important and very much under recognized in at least the literature and philosophy.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm not inclined myself to change my vocabulary That is to say, I'm perfectly happy to have lots of levels within first order, right? And you know, whether one lower order or first order, it seems to me that the contrast is simply where higher order is awareness of oneself as being in the state.
Okay. So the other thing that we
So
should
I don't
talk
think
about,
that I don't see us on this so far. I don't see absolutely any difference of substance. Uh,
I agree.
I mean, I don't think you answered the question that started this whole interesting part of the discussion, which was, in Joe's sense, he said these higher order states are Rosenthal higher order states, but that they don't generate a conscious experience yet. There's a next stage after that. So that part I don't think has been resolved, or did I miss that part of the discussion? So this penultimate level for you, Joe, but it's still not conscious. Is that a higher order state in the sense that we've been talking about, that it's already attributing to you these states?
Whether, David would agree, I'm not sure, but, I kind of punted on in both of these articles by saying, if we could figure out what this penultimate state is, we would be one step removed from the experience. And, that wouldn't be so bad. That we could focus on what this last state is that's not conscious. That would be pretty darn good to know.
But on your view, do you think that, I mean, we don't know, but would you guess that involves attributing to yourself being in various mental states?
I would have that information from the self schema that's non-conscious, But whether you would...
Sorry, you'd have the information in the self that's generated by incorporating the self schema into the overall state, that would carry the information that it's my state.
Right. But
I agree with that, but it wouldn't carry the information that you're aware of yourself as being in that state. That's different.
Yes.
So okay,
it does seem to me, and this is something that I was pressing at an earlier point in our conversation, that for unconscious states, there is it's my state, and it's built into the state that it's my state. So that's the contribution that's being made on your picture by the self schema. And I agree with all of that. But then there's another level, which is the awareness of oneself as being in the state.
So David, would you agree that at this point there's metacognitive things going on, at least at that penultimate level?
Well, I don't know what's in a word, metacognition by any other word. I mean, I think that usually when people talk about metacognition, there are things like feeling of knowing and that sort of thing that they have in mind, and it's not that kind of thing. So I think it's somewhat misleading to talk about this high order awareness as metacognitive, but it is, I mean, if you want to say, well, it's cognitive, that is to say, it's an awareness of yourself as being in a particular state, so it's cognitive, and it's about another state, and that makes it meta.
Right, but I meant the prior stage. So the stage that we're talking about that's non-conscious, but still has information about the states and they're being yours, but no awareness.
I wouldn't have thought that was literally a state that was about another state. I would have thought that it was a state that connected with the information of the other state in a richer way, which is a bit different.
Yeah.
And Joe, you agree with that?
Well, what I was trying to do when I used metacognitive in the second of these articles we've been talking about is, I mean, this is one of the things I've been trying to do in all of this recent stuff on consciousness, is to kind of accept the general format of the modern science of consciousness with, metacognition and all these things that are being studied, and try to add on some things that give it a more real world like quality. So it was kind of a strategic move in a sense to put metacognition in there to just include, to make it not something alien to the field, but something that is, kind of talked about. And I was thinking of it as a cognition about other cognitions and metacognitive in that sense. So, which is what I meant when, David had captured what I was talking about when he said putting together of other information. So you got, visual and auditory, you got self, and you got fear scheme, all these things coming together. I kind of thought of that as a metacognitive operation, but, I'm open to,
But it's not representing those states. It's just connecting information that's in the states or something like that.
Well, you might have to represent them to connect them. I don't know. So you have to put them together.
You might have to represent the information in order to connect the different informations, but that's not the same as representing the different states.
Well, let's talk about that because I'm not very clear on what that means.
Well, so I see you and hear you at the same time, and somehow this cross-modal stuff calls for some kind of connecting between the two kinds of information. So I have to connect the auditory information with the visual information, the auditory input with the visual input, but I don't have to, in order to do that, I don't have to have a state that says, I am in this state and I'm in this state, and the way these states connect is this. I can just connect the information. I can connect the content of the states without thinking about the states.
Yeah, I was thinking of it more as a kind of re-representation of the lower order states into one mega representation. But,
okay, but a re-representation is just representing the information over again.
Right.
It's not representing oneself as being in a particular state.
Yeah, I was thinking that doesn't happen till, after that mega representation is.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
I think it sounds to me as though we're on the same page, but there's a bit of difference in terminology.
Right. Yeah.
But it does sound like the way Joe's thinking about it, and I think you got him, you're sort of agreeing now, is that there is something metacognitive as like the way typically, so metacognition has kind of grown past feeling of knowing and tip of the tongue and that sort of stuff, and just kind of has been used as a general, monitoring your own performance or
monitoring your own performance as your own performance is different from information processing, right? And I think that what's going on here is taking the information and representing it over again in a more complicated way, which, if you want to call that metacognitive, I think that, I think that metacognition has become a very sexy term, so that it's a nice thing to talk about. But so I don't mind using the term. Well, I do mind using the term, but I can live with people using the term as long as we're clear about what the term means and what it doesn't mean. That's all.
So, I was kind of waffling in that diagram that it will be in the next article, where I also talked about it as a mental model, which captures better, I think, this idea of integration of all of these things into something that can be used not only as a precursor to consciousness, but to control behavior and language and other things.
Sure.
Yeah. So, okay. So in that sense, I'm having trouble seeing how it wouldn't be counted as a higher order state, accepting that you're not saying I'm aware of myself as being in that state, but there
that's
is
good
a
enough
kind
for
of,
me.
Yeah, that is right.
Look, high order might mean any number of things, but the way I introduced the term in the context of a higher order theory of consciousness, and I take it that the horror, the I forget always what horror stands for, but higher order representation of representation.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of a specialized sense of higher order. And there could be other senses, and I don't care about the term as long
But
as
David, I thought that the way you introduced the term was just that higher order means representation of something mental, and first order means representation of something non-mental.
no, absolutely not.
Okay.
High order, and the way I intended to introduce it, and I think
Well, awareness of something mental.
no, not awareness of something mental. So here's an example. Here's a counterexample. I could be aware of some thought that you have. Now I'm being aware of something mental, right? It's your thought. High order is a state of awareness in which I'm aware of myself as being in a particular mental state. So that's a very constrained kind of high order. But as I say, I don't really care about, I mean, I think it's a little late for me to give up the term because I've been using...
Yes, I'm somewhat surprised by that, because I thought that, well, there'd be many kinds of higher order states, and then a certain sort of special kind, which would account for consciousness on your view, but that you could have higher order thoughts about, that you got by inference or by going to a therapist, and about even states of other person's minds. They wouldn't result in conscious experience, but they'd still count as higher order thoughts on your view, I would have thought. But I guess you're now saying that I'd have to go back and check some
Richard,
of these references.
I would have thought that I know where, so I could learn, I could learn in an inferential way that I'm in some kind of state. And according to me, that wouldn't result in the state being a conscious state.
Right.
I don't think I've ever referred to...
But it would result in you being in a higher order state.
I don't think I've ever referred to that as a higher order state, but maybe I have. But look, I don't care about this, right?
Yeah.
If you would like the word, let me bequeath it to you.
No, I was just trying to,
I mean,
I thought I understood what you had said previously, but
okay, but I mean, I don't think I said that, but if I did, then I said something that I don't think I said, but that doesn't matter. All that matters is that we be clear about what we're talking about.
Yeah. Okay.
So, but I don't think that there's an issue there, is it? Is there an issue?
Well, no, just an issue about whether I understood your view this entire time.
No. Just
that,
whether you understood my use of English.
Exactly.
But that's really not a very interesting issue.
Yeah, because in the repression case, you would still have a thought that I am in a state. You would just get it by inference from a therapist or something like that. So it still seems like it would be higher order in the sense of you being aware of a certain state that you're in it even.
Okay, I don't care about the use of the term.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll let that go then. So, hey, someone has been asking on the who's viewing this if the distinction between affect and emotion might be useful in this discussion. And Joe, I know you have special feelings about affect, so can I get you to?
I tend not to use it because I think it muddies the waters. But I'm kind of a stickler for like keeping emotion to refer to the conscious experience so that we don't get confused when we use it to talk about animal behavior and stuff. But I can see how affect being a kind of like somewhat lower order in the experiential hierarchy of things, that it could be kind of a non-conscious, more enduring kind of presence there. It's not a term I particularly want to use, but I could see how, I see why people use it, and there's the whole field now is called affective neuroscience. So.
Right, but you're going to deny that that's where the experience is.
Right. I mean, can the person tell us whether they mean it as experience or as more the non-conscious?
They mean it as experience. It's Eric Leonardis, by the way, who's, I think we know. I don't know if you know him, Joe, actually, but I think David does. But his name is Eric Leonardis.
Okay.
But anyway, so he says, emotion is more deliberative and cognitive. Affect is a set of physiological states and experiences that emotions are labeling.
Well, it could be, I mean, you could call that a lower order state that's being, re-represented in a higher order way, I guess. But yeah, I mean.
But so the question I was asking was, you would deny that it's experiential, right? There's no affect is not where the experience.
Yeah, right. I wouldn't call it, you wouldn't have that feeling of being in that state. It'd be more of a kind of non-conscious antecedent.
So would you be okay assigning that kind of property to non-human animals?
Non-conscious antecedents?
Yeah.
I mean, I'll even, I'm perfectly willing to say that rats and mice and birds and cats and all other mammals have some kind of subjective experience. It's just not what we have. It's not the kind of higher order stuff we're talking about here today. And if I've made diagrams that I've used in lectures showing that there are some areas of the human brain, one area in particular, the lateral frontal pole, that is not present in either other primates. There are areas in other primates, like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that are present in other mammals. And then there's cortex that all mammals share. So these medial prefrontal areas that other mammals have could be giving them some kind of, non-conscious state. The only problem is, how do you know what they're experiencing? So just as a, kind of practical point of view, I like to talk about emotions and consciousness in people, since otherwise it's just a guess about what's going on. And there's
Even with
we can understand without bringing consciousness into animal behavior. And every time we bring it in, it just muddies the waters.
Yeah, so I mean, this is something I want to ask about the animal issue in a second, but so this is something that I think is interesting about your view, because so in order to have the conscious experience of fear, we need to label it as fear, so that we have to have the word. But I think it's part of your view, Joe. This is something I've only really fully appreciated kind of late after all of this stuff. But I think it's part of your view that there is no standard feeling of fear. Is that right? That it's everybody's feeling of fear is different.
Right.
I guess I found that somewhat surprising, because I would have thought that fear was identified by a certain kind of phenomenon, like the way it felt. But for you, it's just however you feel when you think there's danger.
So, what's universal is danger. So every culture with a language has a word for danger, because it's such an important thing in an organism or a person's life. So we all have a word for danger, experiences that happen when we're in danger. We can translate those into fear, but we know that cultures have different kinds of experiences, even though they're talking about the same word. So fear in, I don't know, some place in some other, exotic place in the world is not necessarily what fear is here. And by the same token, what fear is for me is different from what it is for you, because we've all accumulated fear schema based on different experiences of what fear is. So whenever a danger occurs, it activates your fear schema, and your personal understanding of what fear is what you experience. And it's going to be kind of like what everybody else has, because it's all about danger, and it's danger that's universal. We all share danger. We don't all share the same fear. I mean, unless it was innate, it couldn't be the same. Also, I want to make a point about, you don't have to have a word like fear to experience a state of distress when in danger, but you have to have a word like fear to experience what the English word fear means.
Well, I'm not sure I understand that last bit, but
So
I
words
agreed with everything else.
Words are big garbage cans of information. And so when you apply that word, that kind of solidifies across.
Oh, okay, sure. No,
But
that,
the actual experience is going to be different because your brain has acquired different information.
no, I agree with all of that. And it does seem to me, Richard, I mean, that's got to be true. Forget about any of this cross-cultural stuff, which, you know, is very inviting, but I don't know anything about it. Some people are very afraid of things, and some people are very bold, and they experience fear, but they don't get blown away by it. And among each group, people vary a lot, and so I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I would imagine that to use the terrible phrase of the last half century or something, what it's like must be different for these different people, because they're, as Joe says, they're experiencing it in a different way, really.
To put it in the terms you brought up, it's like the conceptualization that underlies your fear is your conceptualization.
Exactly, exactly.
Are you guys going to say that about perception of red, seeing dogs? I mean, my experience as of a dog, I take it in many ways is the same as of yours, even if I know more about dogs or
Oh,
like them
absolutely
less.
not. Absolutely not. I have had dogs that you've never met, and you don't even know anything about these dogs that I've had. And these dogs that I've lived with were very important in my experience of dogs and how I think about dogs. So I went for a walk in the park this morning in order not to go completely stir crazy staying home. And I see dogs, and my associations are very, they're channeled and sculpted by my experiences of dogs that are very important to me.
Yeah,
Red,
I mean, I agree with all that.
red is a little bit less tinged by all of these things, but I bet it's a little bit tinged.
Yeah, but so, I mean, there's a thing there that's I agree with, and a thing which I find is kind of fantastic.
I mean, supposing I'd
couldn't
grown
agree
up in a
with.
black and white room, and then the first color, the first chromatic color that I ever saw was red, right? This would make red very different for me than red probably is for you. It would give meaning to red that you just don't have for red.
Right, I agree with all that. That's the part which I think is fairly mundane. But the
I think it's
subjective
mundane, but I think
experience
it's
of
very often overlooked, and I think it's important.
well, it's okay. So it's not mundane. It's important, but there's a core thing there which would be similar between us in the experience of red and the seeing a dog. Like if we both visually are looking at the dog, and you owned one just like it, and I've never seen a dog like that. So we have all sorts of different associations. I can agree with that. Your experience will be very meaningful. Mine will be like, it's a dog. But nonetheless, there's a kind of visual percept there, which is the same between us, given that we function the same way, have the same receptors and so forth. So, you know, the black nose and the brownish red or whatever the color of the dog is gonna, I mean, that part's gonna be the same. We're experience that the same.
That's your visual cortex talking to your prefrontal. That's ignoring all the other conceptual and memory circuits that are also talking to it, which are giving unique properties to dogs to you.
Agreed.
Okay, but I don't, so there's still something there that's the same between us is what I'm, so whether there's the differences, I agree.
Right.
But is there something that's the same between us when we experience these things?
So in danger, there's something that's similar to all of us, even though our fear experience that we conceptualize is different. So there is a core that starts out in the world that's going to be the same. It's going to be the same trigger, but the way it gets, you know, unpacked in the brain is going to be different because it's going through different synapses in my brain than in yours because you haven't had the experiences I've had.
Yeah, I just find that really hard to believe that when I feel fear, it's different than when you feel fear, except for in these richer connections,
Fear is
how I respond to it.
It's a cultural meme. It's just an idea that we have, and we have a word so we can share it. But why would it be the same?
Because it's a feeling.
Well, it would be,
I mean,
there's a way of talking about, I mean, so Chairs. Chairs are all the same. Well, they're all different. So there's a way of talking about your fear and Richard's fear and my fear where it's all the same, but then there's another way in which it's all different. And I think that, I mean, there's a heavy overlap among all of our fears. And then there are the individual differences.
Okay. So you agree there's a heavy overlap, though.
Is for what makes them what makes it personal and unique to you. I mean, it's ultimately all filters through. It's kind of like the same at the beginning, but as you go deeper into the system, it becomes, and that's the parts that really matter to you, is those last ones that kind of tag it for you.
Well, I don't know what it is that really matters to me. It might just matter to me that I'm going to catch the virus, and all of the complications about how I experience that don't matter to me so much. Or it might be that all of those complications do matter to me. That what matters to me, what's a big deal to me, can vary with the situation. So I don't think it's a matter of what matters to me, but I agree with you that all of the complicated stuff that makes it individual, it's certainly there.
Yeah, no, I agree with you too. But so the reason why I found this surprising was because I thought we agreed that fear is a conscious experience, the individuated by how it feels. And I would have thought that
I don't know what this how it feels stuff is. What's this? Is that some philosophy thing?
Yeah, it just means the way you consciously
what it's like
experience.
Is there, so
yeah, what it's like for you,
what it's like for me,
right?
I don't know what it's like stuff is. I know I'm supposed to, because you know,
I was trying not to use that term, but I mean that the emotions are feelings. That's what they are. And maybe I'm thinking too much in terms of.
Well, I think that there's a problem about the word feeling, which is that it's used for a very great many different kinds of psychological states. So, for example, it's used for fear and anger and joy. It might be used for love, which is a very complicated thing and very variable depending on what you're loving. It's also used for pain. In simple-minded discussions in philosophy, pain is contrasted with pleasure, which is a little crazy because unless you just mean painful experiences, and then it's not pain, literally speaking, it's just experiences you don't like, right? But the word feeling is used in this sort of omnivorous way all over the place. And sometimes if it's literally bodily pain, then you might say, well, there's a what it's like in Tom Nagel's sense. But it's much more complicated with fear or anger or joy, and any of these emotional states. There's no simple what it's like in this way, what it feels like, I think.
I mean, I feel like I can identify fears at different times.
Oh, I'm sure you know when you're afraid.
And and it's the same feeling I've identified in each case. When I'm afraid of, I mean, I have anxiety about flying. I have anxiety about going through long tunnels.
I think anxiety and fear aren't quite the same.
No, anxiety is thinking about fearing something that hasn't happened yet, and fear is like it's currently in the environment, but they're related. But anyway, so whatever you think about that distinction, I think I can identify them as the same feeling, just about different stuff.
But you recognize it as your same feeling.
Yeah.
It means it's the same as my same feeling.
Have you known people, I've known people who, when their feelings are hurt, they act as though they're angry. And then they can sort of come to a realization that they're not really angry at the other person. They just feel hurt. And that's a very different kind of feeling. And so they're
Yeah.
confused about what they feel. It's not as though one can always just look inside and say, well, this is what my feeling really is.
I mean, I guess I'd say they're having they're having a conscious experience, which they're not wrong about. And then later they come to reinterpret the cause of it or something like that. But I don't think that that's a case where they're wrong about what they're feeling. They're wrong about the psychological state that's causing the feeling or something, or how they interpret it.
Well, I mean, there's another model that one might use. I call it the high order thought theory. And on that model, there's a first order state. Forgive me, Joe.
That's all
I'm going
right.
to stick with first order. And it's a very complicated first order state that has a lot of levels within it. I want to stress that I agree totally about that. There's a first order state, and then there's a higher order state. And the higher order state is to the effect that one is in a particular first order state. And it might be that the first order state that one is aware of oneself as being in is a state that one actually isn't in. So in the case that I'm imagining, one is aware of oneself as being in a state of being angry, and one is not actually in that state. One is in a different state, namely a state of being hurt.
Yeah, but what one consciously experiences is anger. And you're not wrong about that.
Well, I'm not interested in what I'm wrong about. I mean, what I am wrong about is whether I'm actually in a state of being angry.
You're in a conscious state of being angry.
Well, I'm aware of myself as being angry, but I'm not angry.
You're not in a first order state of anger, but you're consciously experiencing, your experience is angry.
Yes, okay. Yeah, okay. I'm not sure whether there's more than a terminological difference between us here. But the thing that I wanted to stress was it's not as though one can look inside and always tell what emotional state one is in. That's all.
Right. One can't look inside and tell what first order state one is in, but one I don't think is wrong about what they're experiencing.
Okay, so one isn't wrong about what state one seems to be in.
Right.
But one is wrong about what state one is actually in.
Right. Yeah.
Terrific.
Yeah, I agree with that. But that's not an objection
reality.
about what we were saying before. I don't think that's an objection to what we were talking about before, because I do think that, I mean, I do think you're experiencing anger in that case, and it's not a mistake to say that you're experiencing anger. You're wrong that you're actually in a state of anger, but you're not wrong that you're experiencing it that way. And so you can tell by looking in what it seems like to you, and there's a commonality between those. And I take Joe's point that, yeah, I can identify my states of anger consciously. That doesn't mean that they're the same as yours. But I just find that that's a very surprising kind of view, that people's experiences are different in this way. But that's probably my fault. I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad consequence of the view. I just was very surprised by that, because I was thinking that what we're studying is fear, and fear feels a certain way. And that's just like red looks a certain way, looks the same to you as it does to me for the most part. Fear feels the same as it does to you as it does to me for the most part. And that's what we're in the business of studying. But that's just, yeah, it just turns out to be totally the wrong picture on the way you're thinking about this stuff, which I found hard to accept, but also very surprising. I mean, I think of these feelings in terms of, classic British empiricism. It's like, there's a feeling, that's what an emotion is. But for you, it's really individual, the fear experience. I mean, I think this really came out to me when we were talking about
Richard, there's a, so you're very fond of red.
I like
or
blue, but yeah.
You're very fond of blue.
Yeah.
But the distribution of cones in your retinas and in my retinas are extraordinarily unlikely to be the same.
Right.
So your blue and my blue are extraordinarily unlikely to be the same. But there's an incredibly heavy overlap, right? So we talk as though it's the same, but it isn't the same. So there's an individual difference even at the most simple sensory input level.
Well put.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would agree with that, but disagree that there's a difference at the conscious experience level.
Why would the conscious experience be if the starting point is different? Why would we have the same experience? I mean, it's, you know, as David said, it's pretty much the same, but it's the details that are important.
Yes.
Yeah, but it's the pretty
So,
much
I mean,
the same
if
part
it
that
were
I'm
the
trying to
case
focus
that,
on.
if it were the case that the mental qualities for you and me were different for the colors, you know, really different in very tiny ways, very likely, but still a bit different, then the comparisons that you would make and the comparisons that I would make would be slightly different. And then
Yeah.
the way we're aware of our qualitative states or visual states would be slightly different.
Right.
And
But this is more than slightly different, because I know we're running out of time here. I know, Joe, you have to be going here pretty soon, so we're gonna have to wrap this up.
Wrap this up, because
Yeah.
you know, just think of it this way, Richard. There's so many different things that we can say we're afraid of, that even within you, you're going to have different kinds of fears. So you could be afraid of a snake at your feet, or of the virus, or of being on a mountain. You're on a mountaintop and the sun's going down. You have no water, food, protection. There's, you know, those are physiological homeostatic systems that are telling you that, you know, you're in danger, you know, as you're getting hungry and you're getting cold. But you can be afraid of that. So there's no one thing. Or you can have an existential fear about the meaningless of your life, or the eventuality of death.
Right, but that's just a difference in what you're afraid of, but what you experience is fear in each one of those cases.
Each of those fears are different. Your fear of death at some point in your life is different from your fear of a snake in front of you. And
I don't think that.
Okay.
They're different in what their fears about, but insofar as their fears, they feel the same.
Yeah, but so let's say the snake is causing you to, you know, your heart to race and your palms to sweat. But the thought of your eventual death is just a more abstract fear. You're on a mountaintop. In the case of the snake, perhaps your amygdala is making all that happen. You're on the mountaintop, and your lack of food and the thermoregulatory issues with the sun going down and no shelter and starting to snow. Those are different sensations altogether that are driving your experience. And your fear is not necessarily going to be one of your heart racing. It may be, you know, you may have a homeostatic response where you're trying to conserve energy. So your heart is going to slow down to help you conserve energy, but your mental state is what's in fear. And that's not the same as the snake.
Yeah, I agree with all that, but I just think that if it's fear, then it's got to feel the same, or else it's not fear. It's you're grouping a bunch of stuff together under a name because there's danger there. But for me, fear names a feeling. Like it feels a certain way to be afraid, and if you don't have that, you don't have fear. But I mean, I'm not saying I'm
word fear.
Say again?
So you're putting it all into the word fear.
No, to the feeling, which I label with fear.
But that's because you have this concept of what fear is, and so when you pattern complete fear, you experience what you always experience. And if you pattern complete fear to the snake and pattern complete it to a dog, or to, you know, a mugger, or to, you know, your death, your eventual death, then it's because you're pattern completing it cognitively, not that because it is itself a unique thing. That's my take.
Yeah. Yeah, I just thought I was surprised because I thought there was more involved with this idea that fear is a feeling. But
Well,
it's really,
Supposing you didn't
it's
have
not
the
a
word,
kind of feeling.
supposing you didn't have the word feeling, supposing that word were banned from English,
Yeah.
and you had to rely on something else that, well, I mean, because I think that the word feeling is very misleading. I don't think that the idea that fear is a feeling and the idea that pain is a feeling, I don't think that those two are on the same track. I think that pain is a very different kind of thing from fear. And to call them both feelings, well, that's what we do in English. But I think it's misleading. And you seem to be taking the pain model, and you said the British empiricism thing about feelings, as though, well, there's a particular kind of feeling that's like a pain feeling that goes with fear. And I guess I don't think that that's true. I think that that's not, if I can speak this way, I don't think it's phenomenologically accurate. I think it's sort of, there is a tradition in philosophy according to which that's the way it is, but I think it's, I don't think it's correct.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know we're out of time because I think Joe has to head out here. So we need a whole nother session to get to.
We need a whole nother session. I mean, after all, we should have another session, Richard, because it's not as though when the three of us would have lunch at this wonderful place in the East Village, it's not as though, well, we would say, okay, well, we're going to go now and we'll never see each other again. So we would come back and have lunch, and we should come back and do this again.
Definitely.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. So the last thing I know we're wrapping this up, but I just want to know if there's anything, Joe, that maybe didn't come up, and David as well, but that you wished had come up really briefly.
I'm pretty happy with what we talked about.
Okay. David, you too?
I'm very happy about what we talked about. I know that we sort of touched on non-human animals here and there, and that would be a topic to raise another time. But I thought I was very pleased. I thought we accomplished a fair amount.
Yeah, it was very nice, and definitely we'll have to do this again soon. So
Thank you, Rick.
thank you guys for joining me, and just hang on for a second. I'll say bye off air.
All right.
But let's go ahead and get